Hello, I'm Ellen Binns, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Brighton in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and unfortunately, many of us may know a lot about. And see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's June 4th, 2025.
So we thought we'd try something a little different for this episode, in that we don't know the precise names of the individuals for whom our intentions are meant. Rather, we trust that the universe, the universal field of energy, or the divine, depending on what is most meaningful for you, will know where to direct our intentions and prayers. This week, rather than focus our attention on something that's often spoken about, if as an assumption rather than as what's known as a fact, and that some believe has become endemic among many who hold leadership positions in the world, we're going to be talking about narcissism.
And as we talked before we started recording, Clive, I think a lot of this information people know, but there's some interesting facts, so hold on.
Exactly.
And hopefully this will give us language to talk about this in a meaningful way with each other and with other people about narcissism and how it's affecting our society. Plus, I also was thinking, one of the things we love about this podcast is me being in the US and you being in the UK and having the different perspectives. That's part of the reason we came together. I don't think that makes a difference on this topic.
No. No. I think we'll come back to this later, but the language seems important to me because it's a term that can be thrown around without really, we're not typically going to be in a position to diagnose, individuals we're talking about, particularly people in the public sphere. So it's a term that can be misused as well as misunderstood, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I love that point. So on that note, what is narcissism? Narcissism is a personality trait characterized by having an excessive self-focus, an inflated sense of self-importance, and a strong need for admiration and attention from others, often at the expense of consideration for other people's feelings. The term originates from the Greek myth of Narcissus, the son of the river god Cephissus and the nymph Liriope. Narcissus was renowned for his extraordinary beauty and fell in love with his own reflection when seeing his image in a pool. Unable to leave the image, he wasted away and died at the water's edge. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity, self-obsession, and the inability to connect with others. However, as we know, narcissists have profound effects on the people around them, sometimes in crushing and devastating ways. For those in power, these effects can have consequences for organizations, whole societies, and even beyond.
I think I can associate with narcissists sitting in front of a mirror. No.
No.
No, it's usually not something I dwell on, I have to say. Narcissism exists on a continuum, ranging from what is regarded as being normal in humans, involving, in other words, something we all, or most of us, probably have to some degree or other. This involving a moderate degree of self-interest and self-esteem, positive things, right through to the pathological, where narcissistic traits become extreme, inflexible, and cause significant problems in relationships, work, or daily life, and may constitute an actual disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. We'll use the abbreviation there as we're referring to that, NPD. Psychologists further distinguish between two main forms of narcissism: grandiose narcissism, which is marked by boldness, dominance, exhibitionism, and overt self-importance, and vulnerable narcissism, where hypersensitivity, insecurity, social withdrawal, and a constant need for reassurance and validation are the main characteristics. So NPD is a recognized mental health disorder defined by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, beginning usually in early adulthood. Among the symptoms are an exaggerated sense of self-importance, a preoccupation with fantasies of success, power, or beauty, a belief in being special and unique, definitely go with that one, having a need for excessive admiration, tick, oh dear, having a sense of entitlement, exploitative behavior in relationships, I don't think I'm scoring very highly now, having a lack of empathy, envy of others or belief that others envy them, and arrogance or haughty behavior.
It's a big list.
It is, yeah.
So people with NPD may appear confident outwardly, but often they have fragile self-esteem and are highly sensitive to criticism or perceived slights. Not everyone with narcissistic traits has NPD. The diagnosis is reserved for cases where these traits are persistent, maladaptive, and cause significant distress or impairment. Where the term is used as a general way of labeling people with a perceived attitude in the media and in general conversation, we should then be careful not to assume that all who are labeled as such can actually be pathologized in this way.
Mm.
The causes of narcissism are not fully understood, but are thought to involve a mix of genetic, environmental, and developmental factors, such as childhood experiences of excessive pampering or neglect. I think that's interesting. The two extremes are what lead to it.
Yeah. So what evidence exists that narcissism is prevalent among some current political and indeed some of the world's bigger organizations in their leadership teams? Recent psychological and organizational research provides substantial evidence indicating that narcissism is more prevalent among some current political and organizational leaders than among the general population. Large-scale studies in the US and Denmark have found a strong positive correlation between narcissistic traits and political participation. Individuals with higher narcissism are more likely to engage in activities that set the political agenda, such as contacting politicians, attending meetings, donating money, and participating in primaries and midterm elections. Researchers note that those who believe they are superior or have a sense of authority are especially active in politics, suggesting that narcissistic personalities are overrepresented among those seeking and indeed those who hold political power.
Multiple studies also show that politicians with narcissistic traits, especially those who also exhibit psychopathy or Machiavellianism, and that's the so-called dark triad, significantly increase effective polarization among voters. This means that their leadership style not only intensifies loyalty among their supporters, but also deepens hostility toward political opponents, contributing to greater division in society. Research linking the personality profiles of over 90 prominent politicians worldwide with voter attitudes in 40 national elections found striking patterns of polarization associated with narcissistic leadership. On average, political leaders score higher in narcissism than the general population. This is reflected in their tendency toward self-promotion, antagonism toward critics, and a heightened need for admiration and loyalty. These traits have been observed across party lines and are not limited to one political ideology or country.
No. Well, we covered this to some extent in the last episode, didn't we? We were talking about polarization and how that has really become very prominent, severe in quite a number of countries, some quite surprising. And perhaps here what's being suggested is that a lot of people, particularly if they're in circumstances where they feel underprivileged or underrepresented by the so-called political class, actually really do turn towards some of these more populist leaders, particularly, who they see as being strong. So, in other words, some of the narcissistic characteristics, the self-importance, the no-nonsense, the assertiveness, and so on, as they appear to voters, are actually really quite compelling.
They know what to say. They're masters of manipulation. And then they've figured out that this polarization thing works. So now, it's a great tool to
It
use
is. Yeah. Yeah.
if you're a narcissist.
Yes. And where organizations are concerned, academic research using personality tests suggests that CEOs are 3 times more likely than the general population to exhibit high levels of narcissism. Narcissistic CEOs are characterized by risk-taking, a demand for loyalty, questionable ethics, and a lack of consideration for others' experiences. They often hire other narcissistic individuals for top management roles, which can in turn foster toxic cultures. Now, studies of CEOs in the US show that narcissistic leaders tend to prioritize their own compensation and status, sometimes at the expense of organizational health and stakeholder interests. For example, narcissistic CEOs receive higher compensation, are more likely to ignore feedback, and they don't fear alienating co-workers. Lovely bunch.
Oh, yes. So, what are the typical consequences of narcissistic leadership on the people being led? Research consistently shows that narcissistic leadership has a range of negative impacts on the people being led, of course, affecting individual well-being, team dynamics, organizational culture, and overall performance. Within organizations, narcissistic leaders are strongly linked to lower employee performance. And one study seeing a 46% reduction in employee performance associated with higher levels of narcissistic leadership. Such employees often feel unsupported, uncomfortable, and threatened, leading to disengagement and a feeling of not being valued. Their influence can create a long-lasting negative culture where unethical behavior may be tolerated or even rewarded, and in which honest communication is suppressed. Not good.
Mm.
Not a recipe for success.
No. I was actually reflecting on my own work experience and thinking if there were leaders with narcissistic traits. I think I've been very fortunate generally, actually, through my career. But I do remember when I was working in consultancy and working for different clients, actually from a bit of a distance, I did observe one particular narcissist who was a leader of a big department, and it was a lady, and she seemed to go through phases of playing a game, essentially, to see how these bullying tactics essentially could affect a number of people in her senior team. It was quite extraordinary to observe from a distance.
Yeah, it's probably easier to see from a distance.
I think it is, yeah.
And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking in the interview process as they're taking these people on, why don't they weed out the narcissists for leadership? But they're so good at, in relationships, it's called love bombing.
Yes.
And yes. Appearing, they know what they're doing.
They do.
That's why they get into power and probably.
And seemingly there's quite a high turnover as well, because whilst they may get on, they're also very prone to falling out.
Yes. Yes.
Or you get two narcissists who perhaps start off on with common objectives or whatever, then there will come a point perhaps where there is a falling out, and that can be quite severe as well for everyone involved.
Yes.
The resource training behaviors of narcissistic leaders, such as public denigration, threats, and ego-driven decisions, cause employees to emotionally and psychologically distance themselves from their organization, as well as often prompting mental ill health, low motivation, and severe levels of stress. Employees themselves report higher levels of emotional exhaustion, depression, and negative emotions when working under narcissistic leaders. This is due to the leader's arrogance, hostility, hypersensitivity, and a lack of support or empathy. Of course, we're not all equally able to deal with narcissists. Individuals with higher self-esteem and positive self-appraisals are generally better equipped to cope with the negative aspects of narcissistic leadership and perceive less threat. Others may be vulnerable to emotional attack and negative impacts on their well-being.
Narcissistic leaders often initially attract followers due to charisma or confidence, as we said. However, this followership is typically superficial and short-lived, but sometimes it's not.
Mm.
Over time, their self-serving behaviors, manipulation, and poor supervision further erode trust. Such environments can also foster perceptions of victimization and abuse, further harming employee well-being. In the political sphere, narcissistic leaders are more likely to prioritize personal interests over public welfare, leading to impulsive decisions and a disregard for expert advice, which can have disastrous consequences for society. They may foster cultures of division and mistrust, eroding public trust in government institutions and democratic processes.
Mm. Such leaders are more prone to corruption, abuse of power, and to creating echo chambers by surrounding themselves with sycophants, further distancing themselves from accountability and the needs of the people they serve. Poor policy decisions may result, some having widespread economic and social consequences. In extreme cases, relations with other nations can be impacted. Trade wars and military conflict may be pursued, and political opponents may become subject to detention, torture, or worse. Some commentators suggest that some of the world's current conflicts are being perpetuated by narcissistic leaders out of their desire to appear heroic, strong, and competent.
You think? But lest we rush to judgment on who we think might top this list, we might want to consider the thoughts of John Hardin, an assistant professor of political science at Ripon College, who created an index of narcissism among U.S. presidents who served between 1897 and 2009. While not being a fully objective study, Hardin used data compiled by 3 researchers to assess the personalities of these leaders, drawing on the views of presidential historians concerning personality-related questions on the leaders. These were then assessed against the so-called Big 5 personality traits associated with narcissism: high self-importance, a willingness to bend truths to get ahead, being socially aggressive, and insulting in response to interpersonal conflicts, a love of crowds and thrills, and having a preference for taking the lead and acting first. So which presidents do you think came out on top? According to Hardin,
Yes.
Lyndon B. Johnson. I was shocked by this.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt, who actively found challenges outside politics to demonstrate his greatness, ranks number 2 in his list. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt, which might lead to the genetic thing, right? And John F. Kennedy also feature among the top 6. While conducted before the term of the current president and past incumbents of the White House in a 2022 interview, Hardin said that he thought President Trump would rank quite high for grandiose narcissism, but maybe below figures like Johnson. He ranked Biden lower, commenting that while seemingly sensitive to criticism, he is also fairly modest and not as assertive as his contemporaries. He believes that Vladimir Putin qualifies as a grandiose narcissist. We'll put the link to the article in the show notes if you want to delve more into this interesting reflection and information. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. I mean, it's not objective, but it's quite detailed, I think. I think I also had a very quick look at the original paper, study behind it, and looked at the methodology and questions and so on. It's impossible to do unless you were able to sit each president down and put them through the same tests and analyze every aspect of their behavior. But looking at these so-called Big 5, I think was quite telling. It's not all just about control and being aggressive and so on. It is about this love of of yourself, essentially, looking
Yeah.
in the mirror and needing that admiration. Yeah, he explains in that article as well why LBJ came out top, which we won't go into here, but it's quite shocking,
No.
actually. Quite
But
shocking.
it's interesting.
It's
Yeah.
interesting, yes. So very, very interesting. And again, to me, it just proves, well, when this topic was introduced, who would be top of my list? I can
Yeah.
think of a number of names. We've mentioned them very,
Yes.
very
Yes.
quickly. But perhaps we have to be a little bit careful about diagnosing from a distance,
Hmm.
given there are these different criteria. And sometimes also ignoring a little bit of a balance in the way that individuals react. So sometimes those that are seemingly acting in a very selfish way can also at times demonstrate compassion. They can be open to influence, changing their mind under influence, and so on. So I think it was quite interesting, this study, to just as a warning, really, not to rush to judgment.
And I've heard a lot of talk about the similarity between these narcissistic leaders and cult leaders. And they have many of the same qualities and bring forward many of the same followers, in the same way. But I also wanted to mention that
Hmm.
many of our listeners who are inherently sensitive and compassionate and empathic, of course, we are all a little bit more susceptible
Yes,
to the influence of narcissists, and to
yes,
be aware of that
yes,
and maybe do a little research behind that topic.
yes,
Um, Words like boundaries
yes.
and things become very important. So just a tip to maybe, if you have a narcissist in your life, do a little reading
And
about that.
seemingly the narcissists quite often pick up on this, don't they? And they can
Hmm. Yeah.
exploit the gentle souls, as it were. Yeah. I was thinking also just there about a book I read quite some years ago. I can't remember the title. It was along the lines of How to Be a Dictator, and it was kind of a look at a number of the better known dictators over the years, Idi Amin and Saddam Hussein and others, and looking at patterns of personality and behavior, but also strategy, the games they played essentially to stay in power. And that was fascinating reading, because they all seem to pretty well tap into the same playbook,
I was going to say they have the same playbook.
Same playbook. So if we see leaders who are demonstrating the same, maybe that should be a special cause for concern, because a lot of these leaders lasted for many decades, actually. So, where might we hone in with our intention and prayers? This week, as we said earlier, we've taken a slightly different approach to normal, in that we are not naming specific individuals. That would be wrong for us to do, and we can't do it, even if we might have our own thoughts. So, our intentions are therefore not quite as specific as normal, yet we trust the universe knows where to direct them. We also think it is reasonable to believe that there are at least some who display narcissistic characteristics among leaders in the governments and corporations of some countries at the moment. So this is the point where we suggest, if you want to bookmark this point in the podcast to come back to when you're ready to join us in holding intentional, or maybe you're in that position now. We'll put this point as a bookmark in the show notes. So just taking a moment to allow yourself to become centered, maybe closing your eyes if that's safe to do and it feels comfortable, and really feeling into how you're connected physically with the ground, and allowing your attention to be inward as we open up to some suggested particular topics that came to us for holding intention. We will that those who have influence within or upon organizations will be ready to call out and stand up against any narcissistic behavior displayed within their leadership group.
We pray for wise, courageous, and fair investigation of grievances brought by employees against narcissistic bosses.
We will that those who have access to and who are held in regard by narcissistic political leaders will have wisdom to diplomatically challenge policy decisions formed on the basis of personal greed and self-aggrandizement, rather than in the interests of the people they serve.
We will that those who display narcissistic tendencies at an early age will be quickly diagnosed and helped in the treatment of their condition.
We pray for narcissists themselves, that they will see the dangers of vanity, self-obsession, and the inability to connect with others that come from this condition, and be ready to seek advice and treatment that may assist them to manage this and to work towards their own spiritual maturity.
We ask that all who are targeted by narcissistic behavior will be mindful and equipped to know how to offer loving kindness in return, rejecting the punishing energies directed at them, loving the person, not the traits.
We will that there will be a readiness among political leaders who have narcissistic tendencies to recognize and call out sycophants in their court, and to be ready to take broad counsel and acknowledge the potential negative effects of their style on their decision-making.
We ask that where narcissism exists within family and partner relationships, those targeted by it will have the emotional strength to resist attacks upon them, have the strength, courage, and wisdom to know when and what to call out, and the wisdom to know how best to support their loved one.
So turning to our suggested intention focus for this week, as we reflect this week on the damaging consequences of narcissism, especially among political and organizational leaders, we suggest holding as our main intention. We will that there will be a movement of compassion among the leaders of all organizations and governments worldwide, opening their hearts and minds to the responsibility of upholding the dignity and well-being of all the people they serve. Please join us in holding this.
And I'd just like to reflect that some of these intentions are hard to hold, but our commitment is always to hold intentions for the highest good.
Yes.
And that's not always easy. And some of these, we know that narcissists really don't change or even acknowledge that they're narcissists. So a miracle basically has to happen, which can happen. But just remember that all of these intentions are for the highest good.
Yes. It's the stage in the loving kindness meta process that most of us find most difficult, isn't it? Once we've invited loving kindness for ourselves, for our loved ones, for those who are neutral to us. If we are to get to that point of offering loving kindness to all beings, we have to include those we find challenging.
Mm-hmm. And the power of loving kindness is way stronger than any other power. And to remember that absolute universal scientific power of loving kindness and what it can do.
Absolutely.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's daily insight timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.